Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 7 of The Devil and the Deep Blue Me, and I am your host, Rich Bruck. Today we're diving into something that I think touches every creative person, every professional, really every human who's ever tried to do something meaningful. Imposter syndrome. That persistent feeling that you don't really belong, that you're somehow faking your way through situations that you're supposed to be qualified for. And that sooner or later, someone's going to figure out that you don't actually know what you're doing. And I'll be honest with you, even now, even after years of making music and teaching students and doing this podcast, this little voice still shows up for me. Sometimes it's subtle, just a whisper of doubt when I'm introducing myself at a gig, or sometimes it's louder, especially when I'm trying something new or working with people whose skills I really admire. And for a long time, I thought this was, a problem to solve. I figured that if I just got good enough or experienced enough or even successful enough, the voice would finally shut up and I'd feel like I genuinely belonged wherever I was. But that's not what happened. The voice didn't disappear. It just found new things to be insecure about. But here's what I've come to understand. Imposter syndrome isn't a bug, it is a feature, and it shows up not when you're failing or faking it, but when you're stretching and growing and standing on ground that you've never stood on before. And that's not something to fear or to eliminate. That's something you want to, recognize as proof that you're pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone. So today we're going to explore what imposter syndrome really is and why it never completely goes away and why that's actually just fine and how to work with it instead of against it. Because I've learned that the goal isn't to silence that voice of doubt. It's to keep showing up and doing the meaningful work anyway. I was having a coffee with a friend of mine, a fellow musician the other day, someone whose willingness to hustle I actually really respect. And somehow we got onto the topic of confidence and self-doubt, and he said something that kind of set me back a bit. He said, I still feel like I'm pretending to be a real musician. And the relief I felt when I heard that was immediate and actually very profound, because this is someone that I've kind of admired and even looked up to a little, someone whose stage presence I've actually kind of envied. And if he sometimes feels like he's faking it, then maybe that feeling isn't actually about competence or legitimacy at all. Maybe it's just part of the human experience of trying to do meaningful work. I think my first real encounter with imposter syndrome was when I started teaching guitar lessons. I'd been playing for years and I knew my way around the instrument and I could help people learn basic techniques, but standing in front of that very first student, I felt like a complete fraud. Who was I to be teaching anyone anything? What if they asked me something that I didn't know? And what if they figured out that I was just making it up as I went along? And what's interesting from that is even after years of teaching and helping hundreds, if not thousands of students, and after developing genuine expertise in style and technique, I still sometimes feel that way. That feeling has evolved, but it hasn't disappeared. And now it shows up when I'm on stage. Usually thinking, real musicians don't struggle this much with being in front of an audience. Or when I'm on Spotify listening to other independent artists whose work I really admire, I keep thinking, I don't belong here. But what I've noticed is that imposter syndrome has this kind of sneaky way of moving the goalposts. When I was starting out, I thought, well, once I can play these songs cleanly, I'll feel like a real guitar player. And then it was once I can write my own songs, and once I can perform them in public, and once I record an album, and on it went. And each milestone I reached should have been proof that I did belong, that I, did know what I was doing. But instead, each new level just revealed new areas where I felt unprepared, new skills I hadn't developed, or new contexts where I felt out of my depth. And, of course, culture certainly doesn't help with this either. We're constantly surrounded by the polished presentations of other people's expertise and highlight reels and carefully edited interviews and, the finished products without any glimpse of the messy process that went into creating them. So it's easy to compare your internal experience of uncertainty and struggle with other people's external presentations of confidence and competence. And I think about all the times that I've performed confidence that I certainly didn't feel. All the situations where I've pretended to know more than I actually did because I thought that's what was expected. And I wonder how much of what I perceive as other people's natural confidence is actually the same kind of performance, the same careful creation of external presentation while internal doubt continues to chatter away. One of the most isolating things about imposter syndrome is how private it feels. Because admitting that you feel like you don't belong, that you're not sure you're qualified for whatever the role is that you're in, that feels dangerous. It feels like giving people permission to question your legitimacy, like confirming their suspicions that you're not really up to the task. But here's what I'm finally starting to understand. The people who never feel like imposters might not be the most competent ones. They might just be the most unconsciously incompetent ones. The awareness that there's no more to learn or more ways to grow or more complexity to master. That awareness is actually a sign of sophistication, not inadequacy. And when you know enough to recognize how much you don't know, when you're conscious of the gaps in your understanding, when you're aware of all the ways that you could be better, that's not imposter syndrome revealing your fraudulence. That's intellectual humility revealing your potential for continued growth. So let's start with what imposter syndrome actually is, because I think we often misunderstand it in ways that make it more painful and less useful than it needs to be. The common understanding is that imposter syndrome means you're not qualified for whatever you're doing, that you're somehow fooling people into thinking that you're more competent than you actually are. But I think that's backwards. Imposter syndrome isn't evidence of inadequacy. It's your brain's natural response to unfamiliar territory. It's the psychological equivalent of that moment when you're hiking and you realize you're higher up the mountain than you've ever seen before, and the view is incredible, but there's also this awareness you're completely in new terrain and that the rules and the landmarks that you're used to, they might not apply here. From an evolutionary perspective, that awareness probably served our ancestors very well, being cautious in new environments or being conscious of what you don't know, or being aware that overconfidence could be dangerous. Those things were likely very, very useful in your survival instincts. But in modern contexts, we've started interpreting those natural caution signals as evidence that we don't belong, that we're frauds, that we should retreat to more familiar ground. But actually, those signals might just be confirmation that we're growing, that we're pushing beyond our previous limits. Like when I first started performing my original songs instead of just covers, the imposter voice was loud. Who are you to think your songs are worth other people's attention? Real songwriters don't second guess every line. But looking back, that discomfort wasn't telling me I wasn't ready. It was telling me I was entering new creative territory, which is exactly what growth requires. And here's something I've noticed. Imposter syndrome often shows up strongest in people who are actually quite competent, because competent people know enough to recognize complexity, to see all the ways that they could be better, and to be more aware of what they don't yet understand. It's like the inverse of the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with low ability tend to overestimate their competence because they don't know enough to recognize their limitations. But people with growing ability often underestimate their competence because they're becoming aware of just how much there is to master. Imposter syndrome also tends to affect people who care deeply about doing good work. If you didn't care about quality, about serving others well, or about living up to the trust people place in you, you probably wouldn't worry about whether you were qualified enough or not. So maybe we need to reframe what imposter syndrome is signaling. Instead of hearing it as, you don't belong here, what if we heard it as, you care about doing things well? Instead of, you're not qualified, what if it's, you're aware of what quality looks like and you're pushing yourself toward it? I've started thinking of imposter syndrome as a sign that I'm working at my growth edge, that place where your current skills meet the challenge you're trying to rise to meet. It's uncomfortable, but it's also where all the interesting development happens. Now, all that being said, let me be very clear. There is definitely a difference between normal imposter syndrome and that kind of self-doubt that becomes paralyzing or destructive. If the voice of doubt is preventing you from taking any risks or from accepting any opportunities or from believing you have anything valuable to contribute, well, that might actually be worth exploring with a professional. But for most of us, most of the time, imposter syndrome is just part of the landscape of trying to do meaningful work. The question isn't how to eliminate it, but how to maintain a healthy relationship with it. How to hear the information it's offering without letting it stop you from showing up and doing the work. Let me tell you about my own journey with imposter syndrome, because I think personal examples sometimes illuminate these concepts better than abstract discussions. When I first started teaching music lessons, I felt completely unqualified. I had the technical skills and I could play the instrument and I understood music theory and could demonstrate techniques, but I had no formal training in education, no credentials that said I was officially authorized to teach anyone anything. And I remember my first student, it was a teenager and he was a couple years older than I was. And his parents had signed him up for guitar lessons. And I was preparing for that first lesson and I kept thinking, well, what if he asks me something I don't know? Or what if he realizes I'm just figuring this out as I go? Or what if his parents decide that I'm not qualified to teach their son? But gradually, over months and years of teaching, I developed genuine competence. I learned how to break down complex techniques into manageable steps. I figured out how to communicate musical concepts in ways different people could understand. And I developed patience for the learning process itself, insight into common obstacles and techniques for keeping students engaged and motivated. And you know what? The imposter syndrome didn't go away. It just found new things to be insecure about. When I started teaching more advanced students, the voice came back. You know, real music teachers have degrees for this stuff. And the same pattern showed up in my creative work. When I first started performing my own original songs, I felt like I was pretending to be someone else. Or when I started recording for other artists, I sometimes felt like I was, trying to fool audio engineers and producers into thinking I knew what I was doing in the studio. But each milestone I reached should have been proof of legitimacy, but instead each one just revealed new areas where I felt unprepared. Recording my new material led to a feeling like a fraud about promotion and marketing. Getting good reviews led to worrying that I couldn't live up to people's expectations. Or building an audience and followers led to anxiety about whether I was good enough to sustain their interest. The turning point came when I realized that a lot of the real musicians or artists that I most respected also dealt with these exact same feelings. I started having more honest conversations with peers, and I discovered that almost everyone was carrying some version of this internal uncertainty. And what I began to understand is that the more competent you become, the more aware you become of what you don't yet know. When I was a beginner, I didn't know enough to recognize the subtleties I was missing. But as my skills developed, my ability to perceive quality and complexity also developed, which meant I could see all the ways I still had room to grow. And even now, decades into teaching and performing, I still sometimes catch that voice. When I'm working with students who are more advanced than anyone I had taught in my first few years, or when I'm checking out other musicians whose technical skills far exceed mine, or when I'm trying to expand into new musical territories. But what's changed is my relationship to that voice. Instead of treating it as evidence that I don't belong, I've learned to treat it as information about where I'm pushing beyond my comfort zone. Instead of letting it paralyze me, I've learned to use it as motivation to prepare thoroughly and show up authentically. And I've accepted that it's probably never going to completely go away either, because I hope I'm never going to stop growing. I'm never going to stop taking on challenges that stretch my abilities, or never going to stop caring about doing good work for the people who trust me. So now when the imposter voice shows up, I try to ask different questions. Instead of, do I belong here? I ask, what can I learn from this? And instead of, well, what if they figure out I don't know everything? I ask, how can I be honest about both my strengths and my limitations? So why doesn't imposter syndrome just go away, even when you develop genuine expertise, even when you have external validation of your competence, and even when you've been doing something successfully for years and years? Well, I think first and most importantly, if you're continuing to grow, you're continuing to encounter situations where you're not yet fully competent. Every time you take on a new challenge, every time you stretch beyond your current skill level, every time you step into unfamiliar territory, you're going to feel some version of that "do I belong here" uncertainty. And mastery itself is a moving target. The more you learn about any field, the more you realize how much more there is to learn. Your standards for what constitutes good work evolve as your understanding deepens, which means you're always aware of ways that you could be better. You might feel completely confident teaching beginner guitar students and then feel like a complete amateur when you're in a master class with professional musicians. Your competence doesn't actually change, but the context reveals different aspects of what you don't know yet. We're constantly exposed to other people's expertise in ways that can make our own knowledge feel inadequate. Social media, professional conferences, collaborations, everywhere you look, there's someone who knows something that you don't, who's more experienced in some area, or who makes what you're struggling with look effortless. And as you develop expertise, you become more aware of complexity and nuance. A beginner might think they understand something after learning the basic rules, but an expert knows that the basic rules are just the starting point, that real understanding involves thousands of small judgments and contextual decisions and intuitive responses that can't be easily systemized. As your work becomes more visible or more important to other people, the stakes feel higher. When you're just practicing for yourself, mistakes don't matter much, but when people are counting on you, students, audiences, collaborators, the awareness of what could go wrong, it naturally increases. People who care deeply about their work tend to maintain high standards for themselves. And if you're someone who genuinely wants to serve others well, who takes pride in quality, who feels responsible for the trust that people place in you, well, you're naturally going to be aware of the gap between your current abilities and your aspirations. But the good news is, if imposter syndrome never completely goes away, that means you never stop growing. You never stop caring. You never stop pushing yourself toward higher standards of work and service. Because the alternative, feeling, completely confident all the time, never questioning your abilities, never worrying about whether you're serving others well, that might actually be far more problematic than the occasional self-doubt. So instead of waiting for imposter syndrome to disappear, I've learned to walk with it, to treat it as a traveling companion rather than an enemy, and to listen to what it's telling me about where I might need to prepare more thoroughly or be more honest about my limitations, but to not let it stop me from showing up and doing the work. Because the discomfort of imposter syndrome often contains very useful information. It might be telling you to study more before that presentation, or to practice more before that performance, or to seek mentorship in that area where you feel uncertain, and to definitely be more transparent about what you do and what you don't know. The goal isn't to silence the voice of doubt. It's to integrate it into a more complete understanding of yourself as someone who's competent and still growing, and still learning and getting experienced, and still discovering new edges of your abilities. Let me tell you about a night that completely changed how I think about imposter syndrome and what it means to belong in creative spaces. This was quite a few years ago, and I'd been invited to play at this songwriter showcase at a venue that I'd never performed at before. And it was one of those events where each musician gets about 3 songs, and naturally the lineup included some people whose work, I really admired. Folks who'd been performing professionally for years and who had albums out and who had charted with those albums, who seemed to just move through the world with this easy confidence that I desperately wanted for myself. And in the weeks leading up to the show, that familiar voice started getting louder. What are you doing on this lineup? These are real songwriters. I kept second guessing my song choices, wondering if my material was sophisticated enough, if my performance skills were polished enough, if I had any business whatsoever sharing a stage with these artists that I looked up to. And the day of the show, the anxiety peaked. I got there early to sound check and watching the other musicians set up their equipment, professional grade instruments with effects and stuff that I'd never even seen before. And this casual familiarity with the venue and the sound engineer, I felt like I was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. And I really seriously considered backing out. I had the excuses ready, feel sick or family emergency, anything that would let me escape from having to expose myself as someone who didn't really belong in that room. But something made me stay. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I was finally tired of letting that voice of doubt make my decisions for me. But either way, I stayed. And when my turn came, I walked on stage feeling completely exposed and definitely uncertain. And you know what happened? I played my 3 songs as honestly as I knew how. Definitely not perfectly. I stumbled over a line in the second song, and my guitar went slightly out of tune during the third, but I stayed present, I stayed connected to the music, and I stayed authentic to what each song was trying to express. And when I finished and I stepped off the stage, this lady came up to me, someone I'd never met, who'd been sitting at the bar during the performance, and she said something that to this day I still have not forgotten. She said, "Your set was my favorite of the night. There was something so raw and real about it. All these other guys are obviously talented, but you seemed like you were actually living the songs while you performed them." And then that's when it hit me. My own doubt, my sense of not quite belonging, my awareness of all the things I wasn't as polished as the other performances, none of that was the truth about my worthiness to be on that stage. It was just noise, just my brain's way of processing the discomfort of being in new territory. But more than that, I realized that the qualities I was interpreting as evidence of my inadequacy was, the nervousness, the authenticity, the sense of something being at stake. Those might actually have been what made my performance so compelling. The other musicians were incredibly skilled, technically proficient, clearly comfortable in that setting, but maybe some of that comfort translated to kind of an emotional distance, a sense that they were performing their songs rather than living them in the moment. My discomfort, my awareness of being slightly out of my depth, my sense that something important was happening, maybe that vulnerability was actually an asset and not a liability. Anyway, after the show, I had some of the most meaningful conversations with other musicians that I'd ever had in my life. And instead of trying to hide my uncertainty, I started being more honest about it. And you know what I discovered? Almost every one of them felt some version of what I was feeling as well. Even the performance I'd been most intimidated by admitted to having moments of doubt, to sometimes feeling like they were figuring things out as they went along, and to occasionally wondering if they really belonged in whatever context that they had found themselves in. And that shared uncertainty, it turned out, was actually what created real connection between us. Not the performance of confidence, not the pretense of having everything figured out, but the honest acknowledgement that we were all just showing up the best we could in trying to serve the music and the audience. And that night taught me that the goal isn't to eliminate imposter syndrome. It's to show up and do meaningful work in spite of it, maybe even because of it. The doubt doesn't mean you don't belong. It means you care enough to worry about doing justice to the opportunity that you've been given. So here's what I want you to take away from all this exploration of imposter syndrome and why it sticks around even when you develop genuine competence. First, and probably most importantly, imposter syndrome doesn't mean you're unqualified or fraudulent. It means you're growing. It shows up when you're entering new territory, taking on bigger challenges, pushing beyond the comfortable limits of what you already know and how to do well. And second, imposter syndrome tends to affect people who care deeply about doing good work. If you didn't care about quality, about serving others well, about living up to the trust that people place in you, you probably wouldn't worry about whether you're qualified enough. And third, stop waiting for it to go away. As long as you're growing, stretching, taking on new challenges, you're going to feel uncertain sometimes, and that's not a problem to solve. It's a sign that you're still alive to possibility, still pushing toward higher standards of work and service. And listen to what imposter syndrome is telling you, but don't let it make your decisions. It might be pointing to areas where you need more preparation, more honesty about your limitations, but it's not a reliable judge of whether you belong or whether you should take risks. The antidote to imposter syndrome isn't perfect competence. It's showing up authentically anyway. Some of your most compelling work might come from that place of uncertainty, that awareness that something important is at stake, and that willingness to be vulnerable in a service of whatever you're trying to create or contribute. And remember, you're not alone in this. Almost everyone who's doing meaningful work deals with some version of these feelings. The people who seem most confident often are just better at hiding their uncertainty or better at acting in spite of it. Because ultimately, courage isn't the absence of doubt. It's showing up and doing meaningful work despite the doubt. It's treating uncertainty as information rather than instruction, and as context rather than the verdict. So the next time that familiar voice starts whispering about, whether you really belong or whether you're really qualified, remember that the voice isn't necessarily wrong about your uncertainty, but it's probably wrong about what the uncertainty means. It might just mean you're exactly where you need to be to keep growing. Anyway, it's now time for this week's segment of EnRICHment, where we explore some fascinating facts that might change how you think about confidence, competence, and the experience of feeling like you don't quite know what you're doing. Did you know that the more competent people become in their field, the more likely they are to underestimate their own abilities relative to others? It's called the imposter phenomenon in research, and studies show it's most common among high achievers who have a realistic understanding of what expertise actually requires. And what's very interesting about this is that feeling like an imposter might actually be a sign of sophistication rather than inadequacy. When you know enough to recognize complexity, and when you understand what mastery really looks like, it makes sense that you'd be aware of how much you still have to learn. And the second one, neuroscientists have discovered that the brain regions associated with learning new skills are most active when we're slightly uncomfortable, when we're working at the edge of our current abilities. The same neural activity that drives growth also triggers feelings of uncertainty and self-doubt. So then, this suggests that imposter syndrome might be neurologically linked to the learning process itself. The discomfort we feel when we're stretching beyond our comfort zone is actually evidence that our brains are actively rewiring themselves to handle new challenges. And finally, researchers studying successful professionals across different fields found that those who acknowledged their limitations and uncertainties were actually rated as more competent and trustworthy by colleagues than those who projected complete confidence. So there you have it, the vulnerability that comes with imposterism, that willingness to admit you don't know everything, that awareness of your limitations might actually make you more effective, not less. And for my quick music update, as it completely connects to today's theme, once again, surprise, surprise, I've been working on this new song that's definitely out of the framework and comfort zone that I'm typically used to doing, genre-wise and lyric-wise. But I decided to take some of my own advice from a few episodes back and really embraced my weird. I have an idea, lyrically, which definitely seemed a little weird, but made perfect sense to me. And it came out sounding like a definite country song, which is not something that I typically ever write. And even now, as I'm working through it, I keep thinking, who are you kidding? People don't think like this. People don't do this. And honestly, I've second-guessed nearly every single note, every single aspect of this entire song. There are moments where I'm convinced it's ridiculous. And when I wonder if I should stick to what I know instead of venturing into this weird unknown territory where I feel so uncertain. But then I remember what we've been talking about, how doubt often shows up when you're pushing beyond your current abilities, and how imposter syndrome can be a sign that you're growing rather than failing. So I'm trying to treat the uncertainty as information rather than just instruction. And what's interesting is that some of my most compelling musical moments, at least to me anyway, have come from this exact same place of not quite knowing what I'm doing. When I'm following instincts that don't have logical explanations, or when I'm trying things that might not work but feel right somehow. And I don't know, this new song, it just feels right. There's no other way to explain it. It's called Open Inside Out. So if you would like to check it out, please do. And you can do so right here on YouTube or up in the channel description. You will always find links to my Spotify or Apple or Amazon, pretty much any of your favorite streaming platforms. But if you are currently listening to this on YouTube, please do me a favor and subscribe. You'll be able to catch these glimpses of how creative work develops through uncertainty, as well as all of my completed songs as they are released. And of course, this podcast, The Devil in the Deep Blue Me. But first and foremost, it really helps an independent artist like myself, more than you probably know. And that, my friends, is a wrap, as they say, as we close up episode 7, a deep dive into imposter syndrome and why it really never goes away and why that's actually totally okay. We talked about what imposter syndrome really is, not evidence of inadequacy, but your brain's response to unfamiliar territory. And we explored why it persists even as you develop genuine competence and how to work with that doubt instead of being paralyzed by it. And I'm quite aware of how vulnerable it feels to admit that I still struggle with these feelings, that even after years of teaching and performing and creating, I sometimes wonder if I really know what I'm doing. And there's a part of me that wants to project more confidence and to sound like someone who's moved beyond these basic insecurities, but that would be completely dishonest. And it would miss the point entirely. The doubt isn't evidence that I haven't grown. It's evidence that I'm still growing, still taking on challenges that stretch my abilities, and still caring enough about the quality of my work to worry about doing justice to it. So then tell me yourself, what situation in your life triggers that do I belong here feeling the most strongly? And what might change if you interpreted that feeling as evidence of growth rather than inadequacy? Send me a message, leave me a comment, because as you know, I love collecting other people's stories. But if nothing else, Just sit with that question with yourself. Because I think we need to normalize these feelings instead of treating them as personal feelings. We need more honest conversations about the uncertainty that comes with meaningful work, and more acknowledgement that competence and doubt can coexist. And we certainly need more examples of people who've learned to show up authentically in spite of not feeling perfectly prepared. So if you're feeling like an imposter in some area of your life, remember that feeling itself might be the proof that you're exactly where you need to be to keep growing. So don't wait for the imposter syndrome to disappear before you take risks. Accept opportunities and share your work with the world. It might never completely go away, but it seems to be evidence that you're still alive to possibility, still pushing toward higher standards, and still growing into someone very capable of handling bigger challenges. So keep showing up authentically, keep trusting your growth process, and keep remembering that uncertainty and competence aren't mutually exclusive. And while you continue to courageously keep doing meaningful work despite your doubts, please have yourself a safe and happy week.